Most people don't realize how much the Scopes trial has affected American culture in a negative way. And I have Dr. Jerry Bergman here to explain his new book about the Scopes trial. Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I am your host, Doug Sharp, and I have with me Dr. Jerry Bergman, who is an author of over 60 books. And I have trouble keeping up with him because he is really a prolific author, and he has done so much research on many things concerning the creation evolution issue. And in 1925, there was an event called the Scopes trial, and it's where evolutionism was put on trial and as something that shouldn't be taught in the public schools. And a lot of the things that happened during that trial, ended up being a difference maker in our culture. And a lot of the things that are common perceptions about that trial really aren't true. And so Jerry is here to tell us a little bit about that book that he's written.
Yeah, I focus on not only the events of the trial, and of course the main concern was there evidence for evolution given at the trial. The magazine, newspaper articles, and so on basically try to imply, often state, that they had overwhelming evidence for human evolution at that time. Well, in fact, they did not. And not only did not, but I looked at all the evidence that they presented. Now, it wasn't presented in the trial itself. It actually turned out to be beneficial for the evolutionists, but what the judge said is that evolution is not on trial, but we will let you do a paper, write a paper on this, and that will be included in the transcript, which it was. And so they were allowed to basically think about it, rewrite, write, and several scientists were working on this, and they ended up with definitive, back then, paper trying to prove evolution. But today we know that all the evidence they used, without exception, has clearly been proven absolutely wrong, which is interesting because that's rarely ever talked about.
It's quite interesting to me. Now, who was John Scopes himself? Was he a gym teacher or something?
Well, John Scopes was not actually a biology teacher. He did sub once for another teacher, and during that sub he reviewed information on this topic, on biology, because he was helping students prepare for the test. And so he did cover this material briefly, evidently, although later on he says he never actually taught evolution, but the concern was we need someone to go on trial to test the law. They were hoping that they would basically throw the law out and that would negate it so they could teach, after this point, evolution.
Now, what was this law? This is in Dayton, Tennessee.
Right.
And it was something that they had set up, making it illegal to teach evolution.
Right. It was called the Butler Act, and he was a congressperson in Tennessee who basically initiated and passed a law which said that they could not teach theories of the origin of man that contradicted that found in the Bible. In other words, they could not teach evolution as fact in the schools. And there are a number of reasons for this concern.
And then there were some major players in this. We have Clarence Darrow, who was the trial lawyer, and then we had William Jennings Bryan, who was defending the Butler Act.
Right. And Bryan, of course, is well known as a politician. And Bryan was a politician, a Democrat. He ran for presidency 3 times and failed all 3 times. So that is often used against him, but he was actually one of the most popular Democrats and politicians of his day. very popular among many, many people. Why he lost, loss was close, I should mention. Wasn't that he had an overwhelming loss, but it was close, but he did lose. And they keep bringing that up. But on the other hand, he was very, very successful in so much of what he did. And so many of his ideas now have been accepted today.
Now, what was his arguments and contention about the Butler Act? What did he?
Well, his main concern was he was the commoner. He was in favor of the common people, and he was very concerned about laws that disenfranchise the common people. And one, which is not mentioned, one fact is he was very concerned about the rights of minorities, especially the African American population. In fact, in 1902, he wrote a number of very strong articles stating that blacks should have the same rights that whites have. They should have the same educational rights, the same rights in all areas in society, and this, of course, was not the case back then at all, especially in the South, which is where the Scopes trial occurred.
And the events leading up to this, how did this actually get started in that particular time?
Well, the ACLU wanted basically to throw the law out, the Butler Act out, and basically their concern was evolution is true, it's factual, and students must learn evolution because that explains where we came from. We weren't created by God, we were evolved from other lower forms of life. So that was their main concern. And they wanted a test case that would rule against the law, and basically they realized at the first level probably that's not going to happen. So they wanted a case so they could appeal to the higher courts, and eventually they were hoping the Supreme Court would basically say you cannot outlaw the teaching of evolution. That evolution is how we got here, and therefore that must be taught in all schools.
In the 1950s, there was a parody or a play that was built around this trial, and that play, eventually a movie, was called Inherit the Wind.
Yes, there was, and that is it's beyond a parody. It really grossly mocked and made fun of the Christian community. And today, in this modern age, when we are more sensitive about minorities, and especially sensitive about mocking people's beliefs, I don't think it would have done very well today at all. But when it was first produced, it was very extremely successful. Played in thousands of schools, thousands of books were sold about it. It was read as required by many students, and it grossly made fun of people who were adherents to the Christian worldview.
I do not remember when I was going through school having to view that. In fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, I was very much interested in science, and it seemed like the school I went to, we had, the rural Bible mission coming in and talking about God and the Bible, and so it wasn't until 1963 that when we had some legislation passed that outlawed the teaching of the Bible in the public schools, and I'm sure you remember that as well. You were actually involved in that a little bit, weren't you?
Yeah, that's true, I was. And again, my experience, I lived in the suburbs of Detroit, Royal Oak at that time. And a lot of these issues did not come up. But of course later on they did. And later on, and especially after the Supreme Court ruled, I think in 1963, that prayer and Bible reading and so on was outlawed in the public schools. And then the beginning of hostility against Christians was furthered and became more and more strident until we have the situation today where Christian teachers are afraid to talk about what they believe. They're afraid to say, well, there's not an iron-tight case in favor of human evolution. They're afraid to cover this, so they often tactfully try to basically say, well, this is what your textbook says. I don't necessarily you don't necessarily agree with this, that's in the good situations. I've known of many teachers that basically, especially when I taught at the college level, that made it very clear, you want to pass this class, you must believe in evolution. And one example, the student actually told me, when I was teaching at the college level, that she went to a class, biology class, and the first day, the professor asked, how many of you do not believe in human evolution, that humans evolved from a lower form of life? You raise your hand. And so there were 3 or 4 people that raised their hand. And then this professor said, could you 4 people stand up? And so they did. Then he said, clearly, you are to leave this class. I do not want you in my class. Please leave and do not return. And of those, I think like 3 left, including my student, and she later dropped out of that college and attended another college where I was at that time teaching. But she mentioned that, I asked her why she quit the other college, why she left them and came to where she's at now. And she gave this as a reason, that she thought that was horribly intolerant of that professor to respond that way and literally kick out the students that did not accept the idea of human evolution.
Now, if you were one of those students in that class and subjected to that, what would you advise that particular student to do in that situation?
Well, to be honest, I'm pretty shy, and I probably would not have bothered to raise my hand. And I have a feeling there were a number of students that were in the same boat. They didn't raise their hand, and therefore they didn't stand up, and therefore they weren't kicked out of the class. But the students that were still there, and there was about 60 students in the class, the students that were still there learned a lot from that. And basically, you don't question evolution, you don't question the professor, you listen, you take notes, you put down the answers she wants on your test, and you move on with your career. And so I would guess that this had a profound effect on the other students. It surprised me that people didn't object and say, wait a minute, this is really not a very welcoming environment. We at colleges should be available and willing to talk about controversial issues. We should welcome controversy. We should welcome discussions among students about controversial topics. And obviously in this class, and in other classes I've heard about, this was not the case at all.
Yeah, I find that quite dismaying that type of discrimination actually exists. And I remember that I was in a biochemistry class where I raised my hand and asked some simple questions of the professor, which challenged his foundation in evolution, and eventually he came out and said, well, we really don't believe this. Something like that. He admitted that the problems in evolution that he was teaching.
Oh, well, that was refreshing. Now that was at Michigan State, I assume.
Michigan State, yeah.
Michigan State, yeah, well, it's good to know there's some good professors there. My son went to Michigan State, so that's good to know.
Yeah, I did have a professor there. I studied under Dr. John Moore, who was the managing editor of the Creation Research Society Quarterly. And a number of years ago, there was maybe 1995, I think, it brought Lawrence Tisdale out there, and we had a bunch of people from the university that we talked to who were college professors and everything like that. And there was actually a fellowship of Christians that studied these issues, and I don't think that there's anything like that there any longer, but it seems like in the agricultural college, where you have a lot of farmers, a lot of rural people, there was a little bit more openness to the creation message, whereas now I think it's really locked down and very tough to get into. I remember we had a talk out there, and we actually were sabotaged a little bit, telling somebody said that the whole conference that we had was canceled. And
Yeah.
do you remember that, Jerry?
Oh
You
yeah, I
would've been
remember that,
involved
yeah.
in it.
I do.
So, what were some of the main arguments that were presented in the trial, and maybe presented around the trial, that were actually absolutely false?
Well, the most infamous one, I guess, is Hystrelopithecus, which is basically a missing link between us and apes, and they found out, it's based on a tooth, and they found out that that tooth was actually a pig's tooth.
Mm-hmm.
And that may seem ludicrous, but the fact is that pig's teeth are quite similar to human teeth. And of course, as a person in that era, you should know that, and you should say, well, this could be a human teeth, or it could be a tooth from a pig. And we know, and that's true in many ways, which is contrary to evolution, that in many ways pigs are closer to us than other animals like monkeys and chimpanzees and so on. And a good example is, now not every way of course, but a good example is, of course, commonly when certain parts like valves are transplanted, they're transplanted from a pig and not a chimp. Now there are other reasons for that, but the fact is they are very close, and many parts of a pig can be transplanted into humans. But Australopithecus was one, Piltdown Man was another, which is one of the most infamous now frauds in all of history, in all of science, period. And therefore, yet that was advocated as evidence for evolution. And they had several other cases, which again, Java Man is one, I believe, and a couple of others, all of which now have been discounted. Java Man, likewise, has been discounted. It's still debated about what it is, but all they had was a skull, and some claim that the skull was from an orangutan or other animals. But anyways, all the proof that they used has now been clearly proven wrong. And so when one reads that, you can see that it didn't have a case. Not only didn't have a case, but their case was built on sand. And that is indeed tragic. But that's rarely ever mentioned when they talk about the Scopes trial. They basically imply, or sometimes state, that we have the evidence for human evolution, and this evidence should be taught. Well, they didn't have the evidence, and therefore, if this other part is mentioned, and it's in the transcript, I mean, you can buy the transcript online. There are 2 or 3 different publishers which publish the transcript, and you can look it up, and you can read it, and so it's there if you bother. But it's often ignored totally, the fact that the evidence they had was clearly, unequivocally wrong, and that is recognized today as it was incorrect. And that, of course, is true with much of the evidence today, which is being advocated, which slowly we're finding out is not valid evidence for human evolution from some lower level primate.
Now, what was going on with the ACLU at the time? Was that a sort of fledgling organization at that time?
Yeah, it was, and they made their name basically on the Scopes trial, and there was not small, not too successful organization, and had some success, but the Scopes trial really put them at the top of the United States as far as civil rights organizations. And they have grown enormously since then, and now I understand they have almost $1 billion budget. So they're extremely wealthy, and they're continually pushing these so-called liberal ideas.
And what was their main argument that they used, to try to destroy Christianity? I think that's really what they're about, aren't they?
Well, partially because they are in support of a number of causes which are very strongly opposed to the Christian worldview, and therefore I don't want to overgeneralize, because they have done a lot of good things. They have won some very important cases, especially cases related to racial discrimination. They've been very successful and very helpful. The Sweetie, I think his name was Sweetie, the doctor in Detroit, they did defend him successfully, and so therefore they have done some good things. But on the other hand, they also tend to be involved in what we call radical causes, causes that have not been too well accepted, and they push so many things which are problematic. For example, the idea that a man is unhappy, he can become a female. Through surgical operations, hormonal treatments, and so on, this transsexual craze, which unfortunately has caused a lot of harm in our society, the ACLU has very strongly supported this, ensuring that if a 8-year-old, 10-year-old boy would like to transition for whatever reason, then he should be able to do so, and society would support him. And this is in spite of the fact that the differences between males and females are enormous. Back when I was teaching at the college level, there was a question that people would ask, what can I do a thesis on? How do I come out with a thesis that works? We had one student in particular, we usually in a medical school, we give you 5 years to complete your PhD. If you can't during that time, you'll never get your doctorate. And every now and then we have a student who tries to do research in one area, doesn't work out, tries something else, that doesn't work out, and they end up not getting their degree. And so a question I'm asked is, what area can you do research on which is fairly likely to be successful and you're not going to have problems? Well, one excellent area is to compare the differences between males and females, show a picture, tell a story, whatever, put them in an MRI machine and put a male in, female in, compare the two, and you will always, so far that I'm aware of, always find differences in brain scans from doing different activities when the MRI is done on a male and a female. And so, from what we know, when you look at averages, there is no trait that males and females are identical on. That generally males are on the average better, or females are on the average better. And therefore you see a chasm between males and females. And so the idea of transitioning is problematic because all you're doing is cosmetic surgery. You're not really changing a man into a woman, it's just simply cosmetic surgery. And now we know, and I worked in this area for a while, so I'm aware of the data. Now we know that if you transition and you are not able to for some reason, that most people males who wants to become a female, they'll grow out of it. The vast majority of people grow out of it and become very satisfied, healthy individuals without transitioning. Now, unfortunately, when one says, well, gee, I'm unhappy being a male, I want to become a female, and once they start the surgery and hormone treatment, etc., a lot of those people end up with buyer's remorse, but it's hard to go backwards. When you've had this difficult surgery, it's hard to go backwards, and therefore they verbalize, well, gee, I'm happy the way I am, but so many are not happy the way things turned out, and so you have a fairly large number now that are detransitioning. And so they ignore all that evidence because they're going along with a fad. They're going along with an idea which has taken root in this country, and therefore I think they support a lot of causes which in the long run have turned out to be problematic and causes that they should not have supported. And that's only one of many examples.
So one of the things I wanted to ask was about the trial itself. There was a number of things, this has been written about quite a number of times. And what is unique about your book, some of the things that you uncovered that were surprising.
Okay. The main thing is how central racism was to the book. I mentioned earlier, or to the trial, and thus my book. In fact, my book is the only book that covers specifically the importance of racism in the trial and in events around the trial. And I mentioned Jennings, Bryan, 1902, published a number of very clear articles pushing for civil rights for blacks, which, by the way, were not achieved until a half a century later. So he was a half a century ahead of his time in pushing for these very effectively ideas. And the major part of the trial was the book used in the Scopes trial was the Hunter book called Civic Biology. And this clearly is one of the most racist textbooks ever published in America. Clearly, openly said, blacks are inferior, whites are the superior race, and pushed, a whole chapter pushed eugenics. And yet that book was pushed by the ACLU, and so they, in essence, were supporting a really vicious racism which of course Bryan was against. But he couldn't be too open about that because it was in the Deep South, Dayton, Tennessee, and therefore if he was too open about his ideas in this area, like the 1902 article, he probably would have been run out of town. And so he had to be very careful to condemn the law and what it was trying to do, but yet not push his totally equal rights in all areas in society for blacks and whites, which of course did not exist in the Deep South at that time. In fact, it took half a century before finally they caught up with reality.
Now, were there things that Clarence Darrow brought out that sort of befuddled Jennings Bryan?
There were a number. When you have a book, like the Bible, which has, 66 books, and I remember how many words, but several 100,000 words, you're going to find a few sentences that are hard to understand, hard to follow. And what he did was he basically found all of the really controversial parts of the Bible, like Noah's flood, like Jonah and the whale, like the time issue relative to how long the creation took. And to be frank, Bryan, my guess, has never really considered these concerns. The Bible has a lot of information. He focused on other areas, and so therefore he was stymied, I think, to some degree, in trying to answer these questions.
Like Cain's wife, I think.
Yeah, where did Cain get his wife from? And that is commonly asked, but we recognize today that's no problem because he married his sister. And of course people say, well, that would be wrong. Well, on the other hand, historians who look at this realize that Adam and Eve probably had lots of kids, and since they lived to be 900 and some years, they had a lot of family, and the feeling is that Cain moved away and probably never met his sister until later on, and then of course when he married her. Or if he met his sister, she would have been quite young and did not really grow up with her, and so therefore he could have...
It could have been a cousin as well, or something.
Yeah, it could have been a cousin as well. There could be other...
But one of the sons of Adam and Eve, they would have to marry their sisters.
Right.
And so there would have been and this is not incest, it's because that was not something that came until much later, the laws against that, marrying your close relatives. And you would have had the same problem with Noah and his family. They would have had to intermarry and interbreed. And so you have a little genetic bottleneck right there too.
Yeah, that's true. And of course at that time it wouldn't be a problem because the reason intermarriage with sisters and brothers and first cousins is a problem is because chances are that you and your spouse would have the same mutations, and then you end up with a lot more commonality of certain diseases because you both have the same mutations. And therefore it is a problem today, clearly. But back then, of course, they were perfect. The mutational load was probably close to zero, at least with Adam and Eve, it was zero. So therefore that would not be at all be a concern.
So a lot of the things that were brought up in the trial, we have dealt with, up to this point, all of those concerns that were brought up back then, we have answers for. And, the organizations like Creation Research Society, the Answers in Genesis, creation.com, and Creation Moments, all these organizations are starting to spring up. There's like 36 creation museums in North America, and now we're finding out that the answers to these are easy. The questions only become hard is if you don't know the answer.
Yeah, right.
If you know the answer and you have the reason, it becomes a little bit easier. But this is the problem, is that we need to search for the truth. We need to be able to know what discernment is like, and to find out what the truth is. And everyone should seek out knowledge and to be able to discern what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. But that takes a Christian worldview.